So I guess we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Julia Krieger. I work for IBM on Ironic. This is
I'm Hironori Shina. I'm working for Fujitsu and Ironic.
and we're here to present the project update for Ironic this cycle. Go ahead and hold questions to the end of the presentation, and we'll try and answer all of them at that time. So everyone knows what Ironic is, I hope. Any hands for not knowing what Ironic is? Awesome. OK, we're doing good. One of the things that's probably important for us to highlight is the number of contributors. We've had 145 unique contributors this cycle from 33 different organizations. That's up from, I believe, 129 last cycle, which is an improvement. We've also, in the past cycle, lost contributors, which is unfortunate, but it does happen. And I thought it was important because of the questions that occurred at the last summit to at least bring up the graphs and basically show where Ironic is at, because we lost, in one day, we lost 3 core contributors from the event that shall not be named, as it's now referred to. In the graphs, we can see here, that's when the news of the layoffs occurred. The second, actually no, sorry. This was the Pike PTG. This is when the news that layoffs occurred. And this was the Boston Summit. And one thing you can notice is that since then, since the layoffs actually impacted the community, we've actually held fairly steady in our velocity, both in terms of code and reviews. In Pike, we have delivered rolling upgrades. We now support N-1 upgrades. We support the ability to boot from a Cinder volume, specifically iPXE-based or the IRMC virtual media-based driver. We now have a concept of hardware types, which allows for both the behavior that existed with classic drivers to be more configurable, and we have drivers or hardware types replacing all existing drivers that we had in Ironic. We also have a Redfish hardware type, which allows for Redfish hardware use. For networking, we now support the storage of physical network information. Thank you, Sam. We now send port group information to Cinder, or not Cinder, sorry, to Neutron, which allows us to actually, or an ML2 driver to configure ports potentially, even further than they used to be able to. And we, I believe, officially added VIF edition support for running machines, which turned out to be a much smaller, simpler change than anyone imagined. One of their Pike features was that we migrated to, or started the migration to scheduling based on resource classes. And that's a major change that will impact all of us in the Ironic community moving forward. Also, we removed a number of third-party drivers that did not have any sort of CI system, and we fixed many bugs. In Queens, we expect to see our versioning defaults change, specifically to try and negotiate the latest version. We are reworking our service authentication to use Keystone Auth. Previously, we had one-off authentication usage for every single client that was different, which caused a number of problems. We are working on reference documentation for the architecture. Neutron event processing, which allows us to know if something is done with Neutron or not. We're working on router networking and support for rescue mode, which will make many, many, many people happy, which allows you to hopefully recover a machine that has had some sort of massive hardware fault or system fault. We're also working on a configuration interface for the BIOS and an Ansible deployment interface that's coming from our staging drivers repository. One of the things to keep in mind is we are deprecating our classic drivers. These would be drivers that start with Pixie or agent in the name, since we have fully compatible replacements as hardware types. We are also beginning the process of deprecating our original CLI in favor of OpenStack client. Beyond Queens, we should expect to see traits and use of traits to influence deployments. This will probably be in the form of deployment templates or trait information used to influence how the machine is configured by the individual driver. Eventually, we'll see the removal of our classic drivers and the Ironic CLI. Now, I'm sure everyone is aware Ironic has a number of sub-projects within it. We have Inspector, which its goal is to help provide insight into the hardware that actually makes up your bare metal cloud. We have the Ironic Python agent, which facilitates deployment of bare metal machines, also facilitates cleaning of bare metal machines. UI, which is a Horizon plugin. Bifrost, which supports Ansible-based toolkit to support mass deployment of machines in a standalone use case. We have a networking bare metal, which is more for integration networking. Thank you, Sam. Molten Iron, which is tooling to assist with pure bare metal cloud management. That's an IBM tool that I have no idea about. Sushi, which is our library for Redfish support, and Virtual BMC, which is our toolkit for emulating an IPMI BMC. Now, the largest sub-project that we have in Ironic is the Inspector. And the features that came to be in Pike were introspection hooks, link layer discovery protocol processing enhancements. Previously, there were some issues processing that data, and that's been remedied. There's some API enhancements which make people's lives easier. There's also the ability to disable ports upon reintrospection, and the beginnings of a filter driver framework for configuring Pixie or DHCP interfaces. Previously, or presently, the support is the support for the use of DHCP or DNS mask and then Pixie and tables for firewalls is hard-coded into Inspector in the basic design, and that's being remedied as a pluggable interface moving forward. What we'll see is the migration of those two interfaces for firewall and DNS mask configuration manipulation become drivers or modules. We'll see hopefully high availability for active Inspector deployments. Hopefully virtual media support for booting bare metal hardware with a virtual media disk to enable discovery, so we don't even need to know about MAC address for the machine. And we'll see some UX enhancements in terms of supplying a wait state that allows people to know, oh, we're still inspecting the machine. One of the things that is occurring because of some revelations with traits is there will be some re-architecturing of Inspector. What this actually means, we're not 100% sure yet because we're still negotiating and trying to identify exactly what this looks like or will result in. But we should expect some merger of Inspector functionality moving into Ironic as a core component or feature set to help enable people to discover and process that discovery information. At this point, we're not expecting to deprecate anything out of Inspector, and as a result of the split or merger of features, we are delaying the support for WSGI. Beyond Queens, we're probably going to see the merger of functionality into Ironic. We'll probably see Inspector rules as a service or basically data processing service to allow a information-bound node to be processed in a consistent manner. This will allow for vendor drivers or out-of-band discovery to have the same consistency as in-band discovery. And Inspector may solely focus on discovery of new hardware. Our cross-project work, specifically this cycle, has been Python 3 compatibility, which for Ironic, we consider ourselves ready. I don't believe we have changed our gates completely.
We have both. There's IPA is holding up the main one.
That's correct. Inspector is right now blocked on usage of Swift client. That prevents it from moving to Python 3 jobs. Ironic Python agent, we have the beginnings of the ability to build a Python 3 IPA RAM disk. The problems are more, one of the RAM disks we build has very limited Python 3 support. So we have to work around that, and hopefully by the end of the cycle, we should have that done. Also, we've implemented policy in code, or at least completed it in Ironic this cycle. We primarily did most of that work 3 cycles ago, I believe. And Ironic Inspector implemented it completely this cycle. The support for WSGI in Ironic is mostly done. It needs a little more work, some reviews. And we've blocked the work in Inspector because of the basically split of functionality out of Inspector. And our Tempest plugin, we are holding off until we're done with moving all of our Zool 3v jobs into our source repository, which I believe is essentially done. We're just trying to make sure all of our T's are crossed and I's are dotted, as they say. One of the other things that we're working on is the possible automatic discovery of resource class based on information we discover about a node, and trying to determine the forward direction on traits and how we're going to use traits, and the discovery of traits, and how scheduling is going to work with traits. As you can tell, traits will become lots of our life later on. Now, I'm going to hand the talk over to Hironori to discuss boot from volume, which is a feature that he spent quite a bit of time helping us with this cycle. Thank you.
So I'd like to introduce the boot from volume feature. So I am one of the developers to work on this feature. So many contributors updated patches for a few years to complete this work. Today I'd like to talk about the overview of this boot from volume feature and the advantages to make the bare metal servers more reliable. So first, I'd like to talk about why this boot from volume feature is important. So this feature separates compute and servers. So it provides 2 advantages. First one is that it provides flexible volumes. So a user can create a volume with a size appropriate for their purpose with this feature. Then the user deploys a bare metal node with this volume. The second advantage is a quick recovery from server failure. If the data is stored in the local hard disk, the data gets unavailable if the server gets failed. But if the data is stored in a remote volume, the data will be accessed soon by booting another server with the same volume. So next, I want to explain how this feature works. So I'm mentioning the case where a Nova provides a bare metal instance with Ironic and Cinder. So user can request an instance with a volume, like requesting virtual machines. The same API can be used. So after an instance is requested, Nova mediates between Ironic and Cinder to pass information. So Ironic manages bare metal servers, which is called node in Ironic. A node has a volume connector, while Cinder manages a remote volume. Remote volume has target information to connect. So Nova gathers the information from Ironic and Cinder. Then Nova passes the information to Ironic and Cinder. So Cinder gets initiator information of Ironic node to accept the connection from the Ironic node. And Ironic gets target information from Nova to specify the volume the node should connect. After passing the information, Nova asks Ironic to boot a bare metal server. Then Ironic configures bare metal node to boot from the remote volume based on the passed information. In Ironic, two new resources are introduced for this feature: volume connectors and volume targets. These resources are controlled with Ironic API. A volume connector is a resource which represents initiator information like iSCSI initiator. This initiator is associated to an Ironic node by an operator. A volume target represents the information of volume target, like iSCSI target, which contains a physical address to connect. The volume targets are created by Nova based on the information from Cinder. So Ironic uses drivers to configure node physically to connect remote volumes. There are two types of implementation in Ironic for this feature. So generic implementation for all servers and vendor implementation for vendor-specific servers. The generic implementation uses IPXC. IPXC gets the information to connect the volume via network. Then it connects to a remote volume via network. Now iSCSI implementation supports. Now IPXC implementation supports iSCSI. So there is also vendor implementation. In Pike, IMC driver supports this remote boot. So ILMC driver can configure a node for remote booting with BMC API. So it does not depend on network, so it can support fiber channel. So finally, I'd like to talk about the server switchover with this feature. As I told first, the servers can be switched with this feature when a server gets failed. The server failure can be detected with some monitoring tools. When a server has failed, the first step is to power off the old server to prevent it from connecting the remote volume. After stopping the old node, we can deploy another server with the same volume. So with compute service, for this switchover, currently, we need to delete the old instance and create another instance again. It seems a little inconvenient. So I think it would be helpful. It would be helpful to switch bare metal nodes behind the instance by keeping instance. I think this can be done. This can be done to get Nova to switch the nodes in the Nova driver for Ironic when an API is requested. Now I'm using this slide, the API code migration and resize, but it is difficult to choose an appropriate API for this feature. So Nova has also evacuate API for the case where a host goes down for virtual machine case. For Ironic, if the host, in this case, host means the server, compute service is working for Ironic. Even if the host goes down for Ironic, it is not related to bare metal instances. So it is difficult to choose what API is appropriate for this switching. So this work is now in progress. I would appreciate any suggestions. That's all for this feature. Thank you.
So for everyone, thank you. We have a feedback session, I believe, tomorrow, 5 p.m. to 5:40 on level 4 in room 10. Please come tell us that we're crazy. We do appreciate this. And if you're interested in contributing, join us in IRC. We have documentation that has been reorganized and is actually fairly concise and clear at this point, amazingly enough, with lots of work last cycle. And we have an onboarding session tomorrow between 11:40 and 12:20 p.m. in the Exhibition Center on level 4, room 6. Thank you. Any questions?
We heard about the boot on volume. It's a recent feature from Pike, as I hear.
I have not used it in production stage now.
For everyone, the question was, is the feature in use by Fujitsu specifically?
Is it possible to support attach multi volume?
S-
Multi volume.
Say that again, please.
Like Nova, let the node attach to volume, not boot from volume only.
Is the question, is it possible to support multi-attach or a volume attachment after the fact?
Not attach, it's attach two volumes.
Oh, attach multiple volumes.
Attach volume after deployment, right?
So I can see you're trying to figure out, there are multiple use cases. There's the ability to attach a volume after a machine is booted. We don't actually support that in Ironic. A driver could at some point eventually support the ability to facilitate that attachment, but we just don't support it right now. There's the ability to also possibly attach multiple volumes, and that's going to be basically vendor dependent and firmware dependent, and if that information actually populates, that's dependent upon the actual image that's booted. Does that answer your question? Okay, I believe another hand over here.
On the boot and volume, what different ways can we attach an ironic node in a sort of the best possible way to the storage network? Because obviously there's like a upstairs, downstairs breakdown of the abstraction.
So the question is, what are the possible ways to attach a ironic node to a storage network? And I think that really comes down to a question of what the architecture of that environment looks like. Ideally, in a perfect world, you'd have out-of-band configuration where you're controlling using the BMC like the IRMC driver, and you have a dedicated storage network, and it's just not in the picture of running a software initiator. That would be perfect world. Obviously, that's not always perfect, but right now, that's the only facility that we have is that basic network interface that we have when we boot up.
Are you able to configure things like opening onto another IP subnet or a VLAN tag, or is it a separate physical interface? Which of those ways work?
I guess we could probably do a separate network interface with some configuration. There might have to be some forethought into exactly how it's configured and presented to the node. I wouldn't see why we necessarily couldn't do that. That's probably something worth discussion. Anything else?
Can you put access control lists on those ports?
So if it's a neutron network and passing through neutron to the Cinder API and whatever is being protected by Cinder, it would be whatever your ACLs are or your security groups are for that network in that environment. So we're just using the same networking that exists already, with the exception of a dedicated storage network where that would be Cinder's responsibility for basically doing zone masking if it's configured with like a fiber channel zone or some other storage fabric.
Okay, two questions. First, the use case shown was using Nova. Is this supported in a Ironic standalone environment?
The first question is, given the use case was demonstrated with using Nova, can it be used with Ironic standalone? The answer is yes. The implementation details are such that we built an API, and then we built support into Nova to actually populate the information. The use of storage is as individual driver. We can still integrate with Cinder. We do not have the ability to, we don't have any other drivers other than supporting Cinder right now, but it's feasible. And right now, as long as we have the information, we can send it and populate it. We can also tell Cinder to remove data or refresh attachment data as necessary via power cycling the node. Second question?
Second question was the use case showed that the node had to be how do you prevent the OS from being rewritten on that attachment?
The question is, how do you prevent the OS from being rewritten upon new attachment of a node?
Being redeployed.
Being redeployed.
Failed node.
I believe that becomes the question of whether cold migrate or evacuate makes sense, and I think it's to be determined.
So prevent write from the old node, we should turn off the old machine. Okay.
I think there's
Okay.
a flag that's passed through as well, which tells Ironic whether to actually deploy the image again.
So kind of like an adopt.
Yeah, so you've got either deploy an image or it will actually just boot the volume without doing any deployment at all. So you can have a pre-built volume that has an OS already installed.
Yes.
So I can boot multiple nodes off that same volume.
Potentially, yes. There is a. So the question is, could you boot multiple nodes off the same volume and potentially? I guess this is a question we should look at in Ironic because the question has come up 4 times today, and there is a data. We have some data constraints in the database that prevent duplication of a configuration. Although I don't think it actually will prevent you from configuring the same volume. I think it will only force you to configure the same volume multiple times for the same node, I think. That would be a fairly easy constraint to remove as well. Any other questions?
With the plan to deprecate classic drivers, is there a migration path for moving it to the newer hardware types?
The question is, with the plan to deprecate classic drivers, is there a migration path or an
Hardware types?
to move
Already deployed nodes.
to change to do it automatically or to actually facilitate the changeover to?
So basically, if I have a node registered as Pixie IPMIT, how do I convert it to hardware type?
Okay, so the question really is, how do you convert a node with a classic driver to a hardware type? And realistically, the difference between hardware types and classic drivers is more a presentation and configuration under Ironic. Under Ironic's hood as an analogy. Essentially, the difference between agent and Pixie interfaces with classic drivers is the difference between an iSCSI-based deployment and a direct deployment to disks by the agent, where the agent actually downloads the image and writes it to the disk directly. So it's possible to set the IPMI hardware type directly and then explicitly change the deploy interface to whatever you want as the option.
Does that mean that the node has to be undeployed first?
No, you can do it while the node is in production and in use. Any other questions?
Will Ironic support network bonding?
The question is, will Ironic support network bonding?
Multi-tenancy. There are bound two of the network interface to a bound RACP mod 4.
Yeah, so we already have support for bonded things.
In Pike?
Yeah, I think it was in whatever was before Pike.
So the question was, do we have support for network bonding network interfaces? And the answer is that we've had support since Okada. The major difference in Pike is that we do ship enough information that an ML2 driver can now configure it dynamically if the driver has that information or has the logic to configure those ports dynamically.
Yeah, so basically the additional piece that we added is there are multiple types of bonds. You have bonds like active-passive or active-active bonds, and what we had before was that you would configure the Tor into a particular type of bond and then inform Ironic that it was that type of bond, and then you were essentially stuck with that type of bond, and the host image would have to support it if you say had an active-active one, it had to be able to support LACP on the image side of things. So now we actually have it so that the type of bond is actually you as an operator tell Ironic that it's this type of bond, and then Ironic passes that information to Neutron so that then the ML2 to that particular mode of bond, rather than it having to be informative. And I think the end goal is for us to be able to somehow pass a user configuration down the chain at some point, so that in fact the user could say, I want an active-active or an active-passive type of bond. But we haven't worked out what the user-facing API would be for that, because it would have to go through Nova somehow. So
And-
at the moment, it's just an admin-level decision.
How does that work when we're doing discovery and the other things, pixie booting, over the same links that will later become bonds but are not bond at this stage?
Essentially, the way that it works is it depends. Well, it kind of depends slightly on the implementation. There's either you have the switch pre-set up into a bond with a fallback to single link if the LACP, for example, isn't running, or we have it so that when we connect the node to the provisioning network, we connect it without telling it to go into a bond. So we say, just connect this single link as a connection so we can pixie boot over it. And then when it comes to actually connecting the tenant network, then we'll connect both NICs and say, connect this as a bond. So that we avoid the case where obviously Pixie firmware, for example, doesn't support or won't support bonding.
Who's we in that case? Because I haven't seen any support for that in the networking generic switch driver, for example, where sometimes we might be referring to the physical ports, but some other point you have to start referring to this logic entity instead.
Yeah. So the from Neutron's perspective, it is kind of unaware of the concept of bonding. It doesn't have a model for bonding. It's all a contract between Ironic and the ML2 drivers. And so Ironic feeds this information. So from Neutron's perspective, it's just a single port. It's always just a single port. And all of the information to do with bonding is passed in a binding profile on that port. And so it's then down to the ML2 driver to read that and understand how to process that into whatever configuration it needs to lay down onto the physical switch.
It's probably worth noting that networking generic switch is intended for CI usage. It's not intended for production usage scenarios. Obviously, it does kind of work in many cases and is very easy to change, but it doesn't have all the features that a fully featured ML2 driver might have.
Which one should be used for bonding in Ironic?
So Cisco Nexus works if you've got Nexus hardware. Please. But yeah, it's difficult to. I can't really speak for the other vendors, unfortunately. I know. I think Arista had support. But yeah, and I don't think, and I'm speaking to the TC about this at the moment, but there isn't a really easy way of discovering what drivers support what features. So there's no easy way of going to, say, Neutron's docs and being like, which of these drivers supports bare metal connections and bonding and things. So actively working on trying to work out that discoverability problem. But yeah. I think at the moment it's a case of going to your particular vendor drivers or vendor's driver and seeing if they have that support or not documented. So.